This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about what happens when a gate agent's split-second decision, fueled by prejudice, collides with a man who refuses to be a victim. A man who, after being publicly humiliated and denied his flight, made a single phone call that changed everything. By the time the airline that rejected him finally touched down in San Francisco, its passengers were stunned to see the man they had left behind, already in a boardroom, closing the biggest deal of his life. This is the true story of how one man turned his worst travel day into his greatest triumph, and how karma always catches up. The air in John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 was thick with the usual symphony of chaos, the frantic roll of suitcase wheels, the distant garbled announcements of last calls, and the low hum of 1,000 conversations merging into one. For Dr. David Sterling, it was just background noise. He moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of a man who spent a third of his life in transit. At 42, David was the founder and CEO of AuraGen Innovations, a biotech firm on the cusp of revolutionizing gene therapy. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored Tom Ford suit, but his demeanor was calm and unassuming. Today he was flying from New York to San Francisco for the most important meeting of his career. His flight was Global Airways 715, departing at 9:00 a.m. Boarding was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. He clutched a leather briefcase in one hand and a lukewarm coffee in the other. In that briefcase were the data and projections for a partnership with Omnicorp, a deal that would secure AuraGen's future for the next decade and fast-track their life-saving treatments to market. He was focused running through his presentation mentally when a man barreling in the opposite direction, eyes glued to his phone, slammed into him. Coffee hot and brown exploded across the front of David's crisp white shirt. "Hey, watch it," the man grunted, barely stopping before rushing on. David sighed, the hot liquid seeping through the fabric. There was no time to get upset. He grabbed a handful of napkins from a nearby kiosk and began dabbing at the stain, a prominent, ugly splotch on his chest. It was unprofessional, but it would have to do. He checked his watch. Boarding would begin any minute. He made his way toward Gate B23, the faint, bitter smell of coffee, now his unwanted cologne. The boarding area was a maelstrom of anxious travelers. At the podium stood 2 gate agents. One was a young man nervously tapping at a computer. The other was a woman in her late 50s with a severe haircut and a name tag that read Brenda. She commanded her small domain with the weary authority of someone who had seen it all and was impressed by none of it. Her eyes, sharp and judgmental, scanned the assembling crowd. David took his place in the priority boarding lane, his first-class ticket, a small comfort. He could feel Brenda's gaze sweep over him, lingering for a moment longer than necessary. He saw her eyes flick down to the coffee stain, and her lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. He ignored it, focusing instead on his phone, pulling up the final email from his CFO. "We are now ready to begin boarding Global Airways Flight 715 to San Francisco." Brenda announced, her voice tinny and devoid of warmth. She called for passengers with disabilities and families with small children, her tone suggesting they were a personal inconvenience. Then she called for first class. David stepped forward, presenting his phone with the boarding pass displayed. Brenda scanned it, but her eyes weren't on the screen. They were on him. "Sir," she said, her voice low and accusatory, "have you been drinking this morning?" David blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry." "I asked if you've been drinking," she repeated louder this time, causing a few people behind him to stir and crane their necks. "I can smell it from here." David was stunned into a brief silence. He was smelling coffee, the result of a clumsy stranger. "No, I haven't. A man just spilled his coffee all over me." He gestured to the large brown stain. Brenda sniffed theatrically her nose, wrinkling in disgust. It smells like Irish coffee to me. Strong. A murmur went through the line. David felt a hot flush of anger and embarrassment creep up his neck. He was a CEO, a scientist with a PhD from Stanford, about to close a billion-dollar deal, and he was being accused of being drunk at 8:45 in the morning. He kept his voice level, refusing to give her the reaction she seemed to be baiting. "Ma'am, I can assure you it is just coffee. I have not had a single drop of alcohol. I am on my way to a very important business meeting." "Everyone has an important meeting," Brenda retorted, her voice dripping with cynicism. She tapped a few keys on her terminal, a definitive final sound. "I'm not comfortable with you boarding this aircraft in your current state. You appear agitated and you smell of alcohol. It's a security risk." David stared at her dumbfounded. This had to be a joke, a grotesque misunderstanding. "My current state. I am perfectly calm. You are the one making baseless accusations." He looked past her to the younger agent, who was studiously avoiding eye contact, pretending to be absorbed in his own screen. "Sir, you're causing a scene," Brenda said, her voice rising in volume. Now everyone was watching. A man in the main boarding line pulled out his phone and began to discreetly record. David saw it out of the corner of his eye. "You are creating this scene," David replied, his voice still measured, but now laced with steel. "I am a paying passenger in first class. Scan my ticket and let me board the plane." "I will not," she said, crossing her arms. "You are being denied boarding. Please step out of the line." The world seemed to slow down. The hum of the airport faded into a dull roar in his ears. Denied boarding. The words were absurd. The Omnicorp meeting was at 2:00 p.m. Pacific time. This flight, GA715, was the last one that would get him there with time to spare. Missing it wasn't an option. It would be a catastrophic failure, a sign of unprofessionalism that Omnicorp would never forgive. The deal and perhaps his company hung in the balance. He had been profiled. He knew it with a sickening certainty. The expensive suit, the confident posture, his very presence as a successful black man in the first-class line, it had all combined in Brenda's mind to create a caricature she could not accept. The coffee stain was just the pretext, the flimsy hook upon which she could hang her prejudice. He felt a familiar, weary anger, but he pushed it down. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Logic and reason were his only weapons. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," David said, his voice cold and precise. Brenda smiled, a thin, triumphant smirk. "Of course. He'll tell you the same thing." She picked up a phone, never breaking eye contact with David, and spoke into it. "Michael, I have a situation at B-23. A belligerent passenger. I'm denying boarding." The word belligerent was a punch to the gut. He had been nothing but polite. The man filming subtly angled his phone to get a better shot. David stood his ground, a statue of indignation, amidst the river of boarding passengers, who were now being rerouted around him, casting him curious and pitying glances. He was no longer Dr. David Sterling, CEO. He was just an obstruction, a problem to be handled. And as he waited, the minutes ticking away felt like hours, each one pulling him further from San Francisco and closer to disaster. The supervisor, a harried-looking man named Michael, arrived 5 minutes later. He had the exhausted look of a middle manager, perpetually putting out fires, and his cheap polyester suit was rumpled. He listened to Brenda's account with a practiced, neutral expression, though David noted he never once made direct eye contact with him. And then he became aggressive. "Michael Tunless," Brenda was saying, embellishing the story with each word. Raised his voice, insisted, causing a disruption for the other passengers. I smell alcohol on his breath, and frankly, I don't feel it's safe for the crew or the other passengers for him to fly." Michael finally turned his gaze to David, his eyes tired and already decided. "Sir, I understand you're upset." "I am not upset." David interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am being subjected to a false and discriminatory accusation. Your employee is lying. I was bumped into, coffee was spilled on me, and she has concocted this entire narrative. I demand a breathalyzer test. Right now. Prove it." This seemed to momentarily throw Michael. A breathalyzer was a concrete tool, a thing of science and data, and it had no place in their world of subjective judgment calls. Brenda scoffed. "We don't have breathalyzers at the gate, and we don't need them. Airline personnel are trained to make these judgments based on FAA guidelines. It's my right as a gate agent to deny boarding to anyone I deem a risk." She said it like a mantra, a shield of corporate policy she could hide behind. "So your judgment overrules empirical evidence?" David asked, his incredulity growing. "This is absurd. Look at me. Do I seem intoxicated to you? I am speaking clearly. I am standing perfectly still. I am on my way to a meeting that is worth more than this entire airplane." The last part slipped out a flash of frustration he instantly regretted as he saw Michael's face harden. To him, it wasn't a statement of fact. It was a boast, an arrogant challenge to his authority. "Sir, there's no need for threats or exaggeration," Michael said coolly. "Brenda is one of our most experienced agents. I have to trust her assessment of the situation. You are causing a scene." "She created the scene," David insisted, feeling like he was in a Kafka novel. "I am the victim here. First of the man who ran into me, and now of your employee's prejudice." In the background, the final boarding call for GA 715 echoed through the terminal. The jet bridge door was about to close. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at David's composure. Among the last passengers to board was a man in his late 60s with sharp features and an aura of quiet power. He wore a simple but exquisitely tailored blazer. It was Robert Chen, the lead board member from Omnicorp, the very man David was flying to meet. Their teams had arranged for them to be on the same flight, a coincidence to be used for a brief informal chat before the formal meeting. Robert paused, his eyes widening slightly as he saw David locked in a standoff with the gate agents. He started to walk over. "David, is there a problem?" Before David could answer, Brenda stepped forward, physically blocking Robert's path. "Sir, we're finishing boarding. Please get on the plane." "But that's Dr. Sterling," Robert said, his brow furrowed in confusion. "We have a meeting in San Francisco. He's with me." This was it, David thought. A lifeline. The testimony of a respected older businessman would surely cut through this nonsense. Brenda, however, was unmoved. If anything, her resolve hardened. This was no longer just about a perceived threat. It was about her authority being questioned. "I'm sorry, sir, but your associate is not in a condition to fly today. Please board the plane now, or you may miss your flight as well." Robert Chen looked from Brenda's implacable face to David's look of stunned disbelief. He was a man who understood power dynamics, and he could see that this was a battle he could not win here, not without causing a bigger incident that would delay everyone. He gave David a look that was a mixture of apology and bewilderment. "I'll call you when we land," he mouthed before being ushered onto the jet bridge by the younger agent. The door swung shut with a heavy final thud. The engines of the Airbus A321 began to whine, spooling up for departure. It was over. The plane was leaving, and he was not on it. "Now," Michael said, his tone shifting now that the pressure of the departure was gone. "We can rebook you on a later flight. There's one at 4:00 p.m., a 4:00 p.m. flight that lands at 7:00 p.m. Pacific time, 5 hours after my meeting was supposed to start. David said the words, tasting like ash. That's not a solution, that's an insult. It's the best we can do, Michael said with a shrug, the universal gesture of bureaucratic helplessness. Either that or a full refund. David looked at Brenda, who was now primly organizing papers at her podium, refusing to look at him, the picture of smug victory. He looked at Michael, the embodiment of corporate indifference. He had played by their rules. He had stayed calm. He had tried to reason. And he had hit a wall, a solid, unyielding wall of prejudice and policy, each reinforcing the other. The system was not designed to find the truth. It was designed to protect itself. A profound sense of cold fury washed over him. But it was a controlled fury. The part of his brain that solved complex biochemical problems and navigated ruthless corporate takeovers took over. The game with Global Airways was over. He had lost. It was time to change the game entirely. He turned his back on the two agents without another word. The silence was more damning than any insult he could have hurled. He walked away from the gate past the curious stares of other travelers. He pulled out his phone, his fingers already moving. He wasn't scrolling through other flights. He wasn't calling his lawyers, not yet. He was calling his executive assistant, Chloe. She answered on the first ring. Dr. Sterling, are you on board? I was just tracking the flight. No, Chloe. I was denied boarding, he said, his voice hard as diamond. What on what grounds? Unimportant right now. David said, his pace quickening as he headed for the exit. What's important is that I still need to be in San Francisco by 2:00 p.m. I need you to do something for me, and it needs to happen fast. Get me a jet. There was a half-second pause on the other end of the line. A private jet, sir. Yes, Chloe, a private jet. David said, a new dangerous energy surging through him. Get on the phone with NetJet's wheels up. Whoever has a plane available at Teterboro right now. I want a Gulfstream, a Challenger. Whatever can get me to SFO the fastest. Tell them money is no object. I'll be there in 30 minutes. He was no longer a victim, begging for a seat. He was a CEO issuing a command. Global Airways had tried to ground him. He was about to show them just how high he could fly. The ride from JFK to Teterboro Airport in New Jersey was a blur of motion and furious efficiency. David's mind, a finely tuned machine, had already shifted from the humiliation at the gate to pure logistical problem-solving. While the Uber driver navigated the congested Van Wyck Expressway, David was on a three-way call with his assistant Chloe and his company's chief operating officer. The Omnicorp deal is paramount, David stated, his voice a low, urgent hum. Inform their senior VP that I've been unavoidably detained by an airline logistics issue, but I will be at the meeting as scheduled. Do not give details, just project absolute confidence. Understood, the COO replied. What about Robert Chen? He's on the flight. He knows what happened, or at least he saw part of it. When he lands, he'll either be an ally or a skeptic. Our performance at that meeting will decide which, David reasoned. Chloe, what's the status on the jet? Wheels Up has a Cessna Citation X available at the Signature Flight Support Terminal at Teterboro. Chloe's voice was a crisp, reassuring presence. It's one of the fastest private jets on the market. They're filing the flight plan now. The pilots are on standby. Wheels down in San Carlos Airport, which is closer to Omnicorp's headquarters than SFO, in approximately 4 hours and 50 minutes from takeoff. I've already forwarded your passport details and paid the charter fee from the executive account. Excellent. Have a car waiting for me at San Carlos. And Chloe, find the name of the gate agent at JFK Gate B23 for Global Airways Flight 715. "Already on it, sir," she replied. By the time David's car pulled up to the private aviation terminal, the world had transformed. Gone were the snaking lines, the blaring announcements, the sticky floors, and the palpable tension of commercial travel. Here the air was quiet. A concierge greeted him by name at the door, taking his briefcase. The terminal, known as an FBO fixed-base operator, felt more like the lobby of a five-star hotel. Polished marble floors, plush leather armchairs, and complimentary refreshments laid out on a mahogany table. "Dr. Sterling, your aircraft is ready for you whenever you are," the concierge said with a polite smile. "The pilots are completing their final checks." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, David saw it. The Citation X sat sleek and poised on the tarmac, its twin engines gleaming in the morning sun. It was a silver dart, a symbol not of luxury but of power, the power to bypass the bureaucratic walls that had been thrown up in front of him, the power to reclaim his time, his dignity, and his destiny. The cost was astronomical, tens of thousands of dollars for a one-way flight. To some, it would be an unthinkable extravagance. To David, it was a necessary business expense, an investment in salvaging a billion-dollar opportunity. He walked out onto the tarmac, the smell of jet fuel sharp and clean in the air. The two pilots, a man and a woman in crisp uniforms, greeted him at the base of the stairs. There were no lines, no security screenings where he had to take off his shoes, no gate agents questioning his sobriety. There was only a respectful, "Welcome aboard, Dr. Sterling." He stepped inside. The cabin was a cocoon of cream leather and polished wood. There were seats for 8, but today he was the sole passenger. He settled into a wide, comfortable chair, the coffee-stained shirt suddenly feeling ridiculous in these opulent surroundings. He took off his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and accepted a bottle of sparkling water from the co-pilot. Within 10 minutes of his arrival at Teterboro, the cabin door was sealed, the engine spooled up with a powerful roar, and the jet was taxiing to the runway. He felt a surge of acceleration that pressed him back into his seat, far more forceful than any commercial airliner. They were airborne, climbing steeply into the sky, leaving the sprawling chaos of New York City behind. As the jet leveled off at 40,000 feet, far above the commercial flight paths, David finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. The fury was still there, a hot coal in his chest, but it was being channeled into pure, unadulterated focus. He opened his briefcase. The Wi-Fi was fast and reliable. He connected his laptop and pulled up his presentation. He wasn't just going to attend this meeting. He was going to dominate it. He would be so prepared, so flawless, that the morning's incident would become a mere footnote, a bizarre anecdote of corporate travel. He spent the next 4 hours refining his pitch-tweaking financial models and rehearsing his talking points. He was fueled by adrenaline and a righteous indignation that sharpened his intellect to a razor's edge. Meanwhile, 10,000 feet below him, Global Airways Flight 715 was encountering problems of its own. Aboard GA 715, Robert Chen sat in seat 2A, nursing a club soda and a growing sense of unease. The scene at the gate had been deeply unsettling. He had known David Sterling by reputation for years, a brilliant, no-nonsense innovator. The idea of him being drunk or belligerent was laughable. What he had witnessed felt wrong. It was a quiet, ugly abuse of power, and it had left a sour taste in his mouth. He was a shrewd businessman who prided himself on reading people, and the gate agent Brenda had struck him as a woman who enjoyed her authority far too much. He glanced around the first-class cabin. The other passengers were settling in, but there was a buzz of conversation. The man who had been filming at the gate was 2 rows behind him, and he was showing the video to his seatmate, their heads bent together in whispered conspiracy. The story was already taking root. An hour into the flight, The captain's voice came over the intercom, crackling with forced cheerfulness. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected headwinds, which are going to slow us down a bit. On top of that, air traffic control is reporting some congestion over the Rockies, so they're putting us in a slightly altered longer flight path. We're now estimating our arrival at SFO to be about 45 minutes behind schedule. We apologize for the inconvenience." A collective groan went through the cabin. For Robert Chen, a 45-minute delay was more than an inconvenience. It pushed their arrival time perilously close to the 2:00 p.m. meeting. He'd have to go straight from the airport to Omnicorp headquarters in San Mateo. There would be no time to freshen up, no time for a pre-meeting call with his own team. It was sloppy, and he hated sloppy. His thoughts returned to David. If he wasn't on this flight, how could he possibly make the meeting? He felt a pang of disappointment. He had been a champion for the Aura Gen deal within Omnicorp, impressed by David's vision and technology. But a failure to show up for a pivotal meeting, regardless of the reason, would be a black mark. It would signal an inability to overcome obstacles, a trait he had no patience for. His allies on the board would use it as ammunition to sink the deal. 2 hours later, things got worse. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and the plane began a series of gentle but noticeable banks. The captain came on the line again, his voice now stripped of its earlier bonhomie. "Apologies again, folks. We've been alerted to a minor maintenance issue with one of the hydraulic flap sensors. It's not a safety of flight issue, but per our protocols we're required to divert to the nearest suitable airport for an engineering check. We'll be landing at Salt Lake City International in approximately 20 minutes. The cabin erupted in a chorus of frustrated sighs and angry muttering. A diversion. Now they would be hours late. The 2:00 p.m. meeting was for Robert Chen officially impossible. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The Auragen deal was dead. What a mess. The airline had not only unfairly denied its best customer boarding, but it had also failed to deliver the rest of them to their destination on time. The irony was bitter. High above the weather and the air traffic, David Sterling's flight was a study in serene efficiency. There were no headwinds of concern, no diversions. The Citation X sliced through the thin, cold air of the stratosphere like a scalpel. He had finished his work, eaten a light, catered lunch of seared ahi tuna and quinoa salad, and had even managed a 20-minute power nap. The co-pilot entered the cabin. "Dr. Sterling, we're beginning our descent into the Bay Area. We should be on the ground at San Carlos in about 25 minutes. The car you requested is confirmed and will be waiting for us on the tarmac." "Thank you," David said, gathering his papers. He felt rested sharp and more prepared than he had ever been. He looked out the window at the patchwork of the California landscape unfolding below. He had turned a moment of profound disrespect into an opportunity. He hadn't just salvaged his schedule, he had upgraded it. He landed at San Carlos Airport at 1:15 p.m. Pacific Time. A sleek, black Tesla Model S was waiting just a few yards from the plane. His briefcase was transferred, he shook hands with the pilots, and within 2 minutes of landing, he was on Highway 101, heading north. The Omnicorp campus was a mere 10-minute drive away. He arrived at 1:35 p.m., a full 25 minutes early. He used the time in the pristine, marble-floored lobby to visit the men's room, wash his face, and put on the spare shirt he always kept packed in his briefcase. When he emerged, the coffee stain was gone. He looked cool, collected, and completely in control. The receptionist greeted him warmly, and he was shown to a private waiting lounge. At 1:55 p.m., the senior VP he was scheduled to meet, a woman named Catherine Hayes, came out to greet him. "David, good to see you. I heard you had some travel trouble." David smiled, a calm, confident smile. Nothing I couldn't handle. Shall we? They walked towards the main boardroom. As they did, David's phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. Global Airways 715, diverted to Salt Lake City. Currently on the ground. Estimated new arrival time at SFO is 5:30 p.m. David allowed himself a small private smile. It wasn't just that he had won the race. The other team hadn't even finished the first lap. He tucked his phone away and walked into the boardroom, ready to claim his prize. The Omnicorp boardroom was on the top floor, a glass-walled chamber with a panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay. The atmosphere was formal, the stakes immense. Catherine Hayes and 2 other Omnicorp executives were present. The chair at the head of the table reserved for Robert Chen was conspicuously empty. "We were hoping Robert would be here." Catherine began, a hint of concern in her voice. "He was on a flight that seems to have been significantly delayed." "Yes, I'm aware," David said, smoothly taking his place. "But business doesn't wait for air traffic control. I know your time is valuable, so with your permission, I'm prepared to begin. I'll be happy to personally brief Mr. Chen on what he missed when he arrives." The executives were visibly impressed by his proactivity. He hadn't used the key stakeholder's absence as an excuse to postpone. He had seized the initiative. For the next hour and a half, David delivered a masterclass. He didn't just present data. He wove a compelling narrative of innovation market potential and human impact. He knew every number, anticipated every question, and answered with a mix of deep technical knowledge and palpable passion. He wasn't selling a product. He was inviting them to be partners in changing the world. As he was wrapping up his final points on the projected 5-year revenue synergy, he saw movement outside the glass walls of the boardroom. A large group of weary, disheveled travelers was being led through the lobby. They were the passengers of a chartered bus, hastily arranged by Global Airways, to ferry people from SFO down to the Silicon Valley corporate campuses after their flight from Salt Lake City had finally landed. And among them was Robert Chen. He had walked off the bus exhausted and frustrated, and was being greeted by an Omnicorp staffer when his eyes drifted towards the executive boardroom. He stopped dead in his tracks. Through the glass, he saw him. David Sterling. Standing at the head of the conference table, not in a coffee-stained shirt, but in a crisp, clean one. He wasn't flustered or late. He was there in command, pointing to a slide on the massive screen. He looked like he owned the room. Robert Chen's exhaustion was replaced by a slow, dawning sense of awe. He watched as Catherine Hayes and the other executives nodded in agreement, their faces lit with enthusiasm. He saw Catherine laugh at a remark David made, then stand up and extend her hand. He couldn't hear the words, but he knew exactly what was happening. David Sterling hadn't just made the meeting. He had arrived hours ago and was in the process of closing the deal without him even being there. Several other passengers from GA 715, including the man who had filmed the incident at the gate, also saw the scene. A wave of murmurs rippled through the group. That's the guy they kicked off the flight. How in the world did he get here?" The man with the phone raised it almost instinctively and took a picture, a perfect shot through the glass of David Sterling, shaking hands with the Omnicorp executives, a triumphant image of success against the backdrop of their own travel nightmare. David concluded the meeting, shook hands all around, and packed his briefcase. The deal wasn't signed, but the verbal commitments were ironclad. He had won. As he walked out of the boardroom, he came face to face with Robert Chen. Robert looked at him, a slow smile spreading across his face. He simply shook his head in admiration. "David," he said, his voice full of respect. "You have to tell me how you did that." "I found a more reliable airline," David replied with a slight smile. That evening, in his suite at the Four Seasons, David Sterling finally sat down and composed a message. He didn't rant or rage. He was precise and factual. He opened his laptop, logged into X, formerly Twitter, and wrote a post. He attached no photos, no videos, just words. Was scheduled to fly ELSA Global Airways GA 715 from JFK to SFO for a critical meeting. Gate agent Brenda Jenkins at B-23 denied boarding, accusing me of being drunk and belligerent after a stranger spilled coffee on me. I missed my flight. Fortunately, War Wheels Up provides a more professional service and got me to my meeting on time. Business is about solving problems, not creating them. Flying while black, shot customer service. He hit post. The post was a digital pebble, and he had just dropped it into the vast ocean of the internet. He had no idea he was about to trigger a tsunami. The post went live at 7:00 p.m. Pacific time. For the first hour it was quiet, gaining a few likes and retweets from David's modest following of biotech industry professionals. Then someone with a blue check mark, a well-known tech journalist, saw it and retweeted it with the comment, "This is Dr. David Sterling, CEO of Auragen, one of the most respected minds in biotech. Hey, our Global Airways, you have a major problem." That's when the dam broke. The man who had filmed the incident at the gate saw the post trending. He replied directly to the journalist's retweet, "I was there. I saw the whole thing. The man was a perfect gentleman. The agent was on a power trip. I have video." He uploaded the 2-minute clip. The video was damning. It showed David calm and composed, asking for a supervisor, while Brenda's voice could be heard loud and accusatory. It captured her dismissal of Robert Chen. It was a clear, unbiased record of the event, and it completely corroborated David's account. By morning, the story was everywhere. Brenda the Gate Agent and How Fly the Prejudiced Skies were trending worldwide. Major news outlets, CNN, The New York Times. The Wall Street Journal picked up the story. It was the perfect viral storm, a clear case of racial bias, a David versus Goliath narrative, and the ultimate best revenge subplot of the private jet. The photo taken through the boardroom window became the story's iconic image, splashed across news sites and morning shows. Global Airways was engulfed in a public relations firestorm. Their social media channels were flooded with outrage. Their stock price wobbled, dipping several points in pre-market trading. The corporate headquarters went into full-blown crisis mode. The first official response was a boilerplate disaster. Global Airways is committed to diversity and inclusion. We are investigating the incident. The public mocked it mercilessly. The pressure mounted. Inside the company, the investigation was swift and brutal. They pulled the gate's security footage, which had audio. They interviewed Michael, the supervisor, who, fearing for his own job, threw Brenda under the bus completely. They saw the public comments from Robert Chen, an Omnicorp board member, and a highly valued elite status flyer, who had publicly confirmed David's version of events. For Brenda Jenkins, her world fell apart in less than 24 hours. She arrived for her morning shift to find herself intercepted by 2 stern-faced HR executives and the head of JFK airport operations. She was ushered into a windowless room. They didn't ask for her side of the story. They didn't want it. She was a liability, a public relations nightmare made flesh. "Brenda, we're terminating your employment with Global Airways effective immediately." The HR director said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Brenda was stunned. But I was following procedure. He was aggressive. He smelled of alcohol. The video footage, both from airport security and from a passenger, shows you were the aggressor, Brenda, the director said coldly. And multiple witnesses, including the passenger himself, state it was coffee. You made a bad judgment call that has resulted in catastrophic brand damage to this airline. A bad call. I've been here for 30 years. She protested, her voice cracking. I have a perfect record. Your record is no longer relevant. Please collect your personal belongings from your locker. Security will escort you from the premises. She was fired. Just like that. 30 years of service, of dealing with unruly passengers and navigating thankless holiday shifts, wiped out in an instant. As she was walked out of the terminal, a pariah in the place she had once ruled, she saw her own face on one of the terminal's news screens. She was the villain in a global news story. The weeks that followed were a descent into a private hell. Her name and face were everywhere. She was doxxed online. She received threats. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors would cross the street to avoid her. She tried to find another job in the airline industry, but she was radioactive. No one would touch her. The name Brenda Jenkins was now synonymous with corporate racism. She spiraled into a bitter resentment. In her mind, she was the victim. She had been doing her job. Dr. Sterling, with his fancy suit and his private jet, was a symbol of an elite world she despised. He had used his power and wealth to ruin her, a simple, working-class woman. She never once considered that the initial act of prejudice, the small, ugly seed of her own making, was the true root of her downfall. She had held a tiny amount of power at that gate, and she had used it to humiliate a man she felt didn't belong. Now the consequences of that act had stripped her of everything. 3 years is both an eternity and the blink of an eye. In that time, the trajectories of David Sterling and Brenda Jenkins, set in motion by a 10-minute confrontation at an airport gate, had diverged so dramatically they might as well have been living in different universes. For David Sterling, the universe was one of constant expansion. The Omnicorp partnership had been the launch pad. Auragen Innovations, once a promising contender, was now the undisputed titan of the biotech industry. A cover story in Forbes magazine featured a picture of him in one of his lab sleeves, rolled up with the headline, "The Man Who Heals Genes: How David Sterling Turned a Travel Nightmare into a billion-dollar Triumph." The article briefly recounted the Global Airways incident, framing it not as a story of discrimination, but as a testament to his resilience and problem-solving genius. His legend had grown beyond his control, polished into a parable for the modern business world. But the event had left a deeper, more private mark on him. The raw helplessness he had felt, the sting of being judged and dismissed based on a stereotype, had solidified a quiet resolve within him. He poured a significant portion of his newfound wealth and his company's profits into establishing the Sterling Foundation. Its mission was simple and direct: to act as a bridge over the financial abyss that separated life-saving medical technology from the people who desperately needed it. The foundation became his passion, a way to wield his immense power, not for revenge, but for restoration. For Brenda Jenkins, the universe was one of constant contraction. After being fired, her world had shrunk with terrifying speed. The public shaming had made her unemployable in any field where a name tag was required. Her 30 years of airline experience were worthless. The friends from work, the ones she'd shared break-room gossip and holiday schedules with, vanished. Her savings evaporated within a year, consumed by mortgage payments and the gnawing cost of living. The bank foreclosed on her modest house in Queens, the one she'd spent 2 decades making a home. Humiliated and defeated, she moved in with her daughter Sarah, a single mother who worked as a receptionist at a dental clinic. They squeezed into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown building, the constant sound of sirens replacing the quiet suburban hum she was used to. Brenda's new job was as a cashier at a cavernous budget grocery store. It was a world of fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered, the relentless beeping of her scanner, and the smell of bleach and overripe melons. She stood for 8 hours a day, her feet and back aching, her interactions reduced to a monotonous script. Did you find everything okay? Paper or plastic? She who had once held the power to decide a person's travel fate was now invisible. A cog in a machine, her face a mask of weary indifference. The bitterness was a cancer in her soul. She would sometimes see David Sterling's face on a magazine at her own checkout counter, and a hot, acidic rage would burn in her chest. He was a symbol of everything she had lost, the architect of her ruin, the center of her shrunken world. The one source of untainted joy was her granddaughter Lily. At 6 years old, Lily was a whirlwind of bright energy, all gap-toothed smiles and scraped knees. She was the reason Brenda dragged herself out of bed each morning. The nightmare began subtly, a tremor in Lily's hand as she tried to color a sudden stumble in the hallway that was blamed on clumsiness. Then came the headaches and a night terror that culminated in a terrifying full-body seizure. The months that followed were a blur of sterile corridors, bewildering medical jargon, and the agonizing dread of the unknown. They were bounced from pediatrician to neurologist, subjected to a battery of tests, MRIs, EEGs, spinal taps, each one returning inconclusive, each one deepening the shadows of fear around their family. Finally, they landed in the office of Dr. Matthews, a leading pediatric neurologist at New York Presbyterian. He was a kind man with sad eyes, and he sat them down in a room filled with a silence that felt heavier than sound. He spread Lily's charts on his desk, took a deep breath, and delivered the blow. "The genetic sequencing has confirmed it," he said, his voice soft. "Lily has Stauffer's syndrome." The name meant nothing to them, but the doctor's tone told them everything. He explained it was an extremely rare, aggressive neurodegenerative disorder. It would progressively rob Lily of her motor skills, her cognitive function, her very self. The prognosis was brutal and unequivocal. There was no cure. Sarah collapsed into a fit of racking, silent sobs, her body shaking. Brenda sat frozen, a statue of ice, the doctor's words echoing in the vast, empty cavern of her shock. It was a death sentence. "There is," Dr. Matthews continued, leaning forward, "one last thing. It's not a cure, technically, but a new gene therapy. It just completed its stage 3 clinical trials, and the results, frankly, they're miraculous. It uses a modified virus to deliver a correct copy of the faulty gene directly into the patient's cells. It appears to completely halt the progression of the disease." A single desperate word escaped Sarah's lips. "How?" "It's a treatment called AG4441, the doctor said, looking down at his notes. "It's made by a company called Aerogen Innovations." The name hit Brenda with the force of a physical assault. It sucked the air from her lungs, and for a moment, the room tilted. Origin. The name from the magazines, the source of his fortune, the company built on the success of the deal he was flying to when she had cast him out of her gate. The cosmic cruelty of it was so profound, so absolute, that she almost laughed. Of course. Of all the companies in all the world, it had to be his. The glimmer of hope was almost immediately extinguished by the next part of the doctor's explanation. The treatment involved a one-time infusion, a complex and delicate procedure. The cost was well over $1 million. Their insurance, of course, considered it experimental and refused to cover it. The despair that followed was a thick, suffocating fog. Sarah spent her nights on the apartment's worn-out sofa, bathed in the blue glow of a laptop screen, frantically scouring medical forums, patient advocacy groups, and charity websites, chasing any whisper of financial aid. Brenda would watch her, her own heart, a dead weight in her chest, convinced it was hopeless. Then one night, close to midnight, Sarah let out a sharp gasp. "Mum!" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mum, look!" Brenda shuffled over. On the screen was a sleek, professional website. At the top, a simple, elegant logo, the Sterling Foundation. The mission statement was right on the home page. Founded on the principle that no person should be denied a chance at life due to the cost of innovation, the Sterling Foundation provides full financial grants for patients seeking access to Aura-Gen's advanced gene therapies. Brenda stared at the screen at the smiling professional photo of David Sterling on the founder's message page. It was a trap, a final exquisite humiliation designed by the universe just for her. "We have to apply," Sarah said, tears of hope streaming down her face. "This is it. This is our chance." "No," Brenda said the word, a raw croak. Her pride, the last tattered remnant of her old self, flared to life. "Absolutely not. I will not. I would rather die than go begging to that man." "This isn't about you," Sarah shot back, her desperation turning to anger. She stood up, her small frame radiating a fierce maternal power. "This isn't about your pride or your past or whatever happened between you two. This is about Lily. She is dying, Mum. Look at her." She pointed to the small bedroom where Lily was sleeping, her breathing shallow. "Are you really going to let her die because you're too proud to ask for help from the one person on earth who can give it?" The question hung in the air, brutal and unanswerable. Brenda looked from her daughter's tear-streaked, furious face to the bedroom door behind which her granddaughter was fading away. The fight went out of her, replaced by a cold, hollowing shame. Sarah was right. This was no longer about her. A week later, they received an email. Their application had been fast-tracked. They were granted an in-person case review. Brenda put on her best clothes, a faded blouse and a worn polyester coat, and rode the subway downtown with her daughter. They sat in the silent, opulent waiting room of the foundation, a place that smelled of money and success. Brenda felt like an imposter, a beggar at the palace gates. The assistant's voice was polite as she called them. "The review board will see you now." Brenda's heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands were cold and slick with sweat. She walked behind Sarah down a long carpeted hallway to a heavy oak door. They stepped inside. It was a conference room, dominated by a long, polished table. Two people, a man and a woman in professional attire, sat on one side. In the center, at the head of the table, sat Dr. David Sterling. He looked up from the thick file in front of him, the file with a smiling school picture of her granddaughter clipped to the cover. His eyes, calm and focused, met Brenda's. For a brief second, he saw nothing more than a nervous, desperate woman. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of something deep in his memory stirred. He was a man who never forgot a face, especially one that was tied to a moment of profound significance. He looked at her, truly looked at her, the familiar set of her jaw, the severe lines around her mouth, now etched deeper by hardship. And in the space of a heartbeat, he knew. The gate, the accusation. Brenda Jenkins. The professional mask dropped from his face, replaced by a look of stunned, absolute recognition. The air in the room became charged thick with the unspoken weight of their shared past. The woman who had tried to ruin his future was now sitting before him, her granddaughter's life resting entirely in his hands. This story wasn't just about a private jet or a missed flight. It was about the quiet, insidious nature of prejudice and the profound ripple effects of a single thoughtless action. David Sterling's journey wasn't one of simple revenge, but of reclaiming his dignity and refusing to be defined by someone else's bigotry. The ultimate karma for Brenda wasn't losing her job or her reputation. It was being forced to confront the humanity of the man she had dehumanized and to depend on his grace for the life of someone she loved. It's a powerful reminder that our choices, big and small, create the world we live in, and that true character is revealed not in how we treat our friends, but how we respond to our enemies. If this story resonated with you, and you believe in the power of dignity and perseverance, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that matter. And let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Dr. Sterling's shoes?